Chapter 5, Process Discovery. This is the act of gathering information about an existing process and organizing it in terms of an as-is process model. It is a much broader activity than process modeling. The four tasks of process discovery are defining the setting, where you assemble a team in an organization that will hold responsibility for working on the process, gathering information, where you build an understanding of the process. Different discovery methods may be used to acquire information on the process. Next, conducting the modeling task, where you create a process model. A modeling method gives guidance for mapping out the process in a systematic way. And lastly, you have assuring process model quality, where you ensure that the process model meets different quality criteria. There are two roles that are fundamental in any process discovery project: the process analyst and the domain expert. Usually one or more process analysts are responsible for gathering information about a business process. The process analyst must be familiar with process modeling languages such as Business Process Modeling and Notation, or BPMN, and also be skilled at collecting and organizing process-related information. Process analysts need to gather a substantial amount of information about a process so that they may understand how it works from the inside. A domain expert is any individual who has an intimate knowledge of how a process or specific tasks within that process are performed. Since domain experts are not proficient in process modeling, they often rely on process analysts for organizing their process knowledge and applying it to a process model. The amount and type of process analysts and domain experts to involve in a project depends on the complexity of the process. The three process discovery challenges are fragmented process knowledge, thinking in cases, and a lack of familiarity with process modeling languages. Regarding fragmented process knowledge, different tasks of a process will be assigned to different specialized resources. Thus, process analysts must collect information on the process by consulting with various domain experts who are responsible for certain tasks. Putting the different views of the various domain experts together to relate to the overall picture of the process is difficult because domain experts usually have an abstract understanding of the overall process. They instead have a detailed understanding of their assigned tasks. This can lead to conflicts in the information being collected. Sometimes the rules of the process are not defined in appropriate detail, which may lead to domain experts operating under different assumptions of the process. Next, thinking in cases. Domain experts will have an easy time explaining their specific task for one specific process instance, but they may have issues when trying to describe how a process works in an overall or general way. A process analyst must organize the information gathered from a domain expert into something that can define a systematic process model. They should also formulate questions based on specific elements of the process for the domain experts. Last, we have a lack of familiarity with process modeling languages. Domain experts are not usually trained to create process models on their own. They also are not trained to read process models created by others. This can hinder the ability to gain feedback on a draft of a process model. A process analyst must explain the content of a process model to the domain experts. They must translate the model to natural language in which one who is not familiar with BPMN, for example, can understand. Next, we have the profile of an expert process analyst. Expert process analysts likely have certain personality traits, usually strong traits of conscientiousness and extroversion. They also usually approach a project thinking about what things need to be achieved. They also usually follow the following practices: get the right people on board, have a set of working hypotheses on how a process is structured at different levels of detail, identify patterns in the information gathered from domain experts, and they pay attention to model quality. Now we have process discovery methods. Different methods of gathering information about a project can be utilized during process discovery. The three classes of discovery methods include evidence-based discovery, interview-based discovery, and workshop-based discovery. First, we will look at document analysis for evidence-based discovery. Document analysis takes advantage of the fact that there is typically documentation readily available that can be related to a business process. Documents such as process descriptions, organization charts, employment plans, and more can be used. There are some issues to keep in mind regarding document analysis, though, such as most documentation concerning the operations of a company is not readily organized in a process-oriented way. The level of granularity of the documentation might not be appropriate. And lastly, many of the documents may also only be partially trustworthy. Many documents may not accurately capture how a process works in reality. The advantage of document analysis is that process analysts can use documentation that is available to them to get familiar with certain elements of a process and the environment it inhabits, while also formulating hypotheses. Next, for evidence-based discovery, we have observation, which involves directly following the processing of individual cases so that one can get an understanding of how a process works. You can either play the role of a customer of the process, which is an active role, or the role of an observer, which is a passive role. For the active role, the execution of the process is triggered, and the steps that are taken and the set of choices offered are recorded. For the passive observer role, this is better for understanding the end-to-end process. However, one must keep in mind that the simple act of observing people performing the process may alter their behavior, such as people working faster and more carefully. Observation discovery's advantage is that it reveals how a process actually plays out in reality. Now for evidence-based discovery, we have first automated process discovery. This uses event logs to automatically discover a model of the business process that is supported by these systems. The advantages of this method include event logs capture the actual execution of business processes so analysts can get an objective representation of the process. Event logs often record a rich set of process-related information that extend beyond the tasks that have been performed. And this method is not limited by the confines of an enterprise system. It can be used to reconstruct end-to-end processes that span various systems. There are some limitations of this method, and they include event logs are not always readily available or may contain errors. The resulting models may also be too low levels to understand depending on the granularity in which process information was logged. For interview-based discovery, this aims at interviewing domain experts to inquire about how a process is executed. First, individuals are approached for an initial interview, then the interview takes place. Two strategies can be used when conducting an interview. First is that you can start from process outcomes and work your way backwards until you reach the process triggers. Or second, you can start from the triggers, then proceed forward until you reach the process outcomes. During each interview, it must be clarified what input is expected from prior upstream activities, what decisions are taken, what is the output of the activities, and to what is then forwarded. It's more effective to balance between a free-form and structured approach during an interview. After the initial interview is complete, analysts can build a process model offline based on interview notes and recordings. Then, domain experts must be consulted in order to validate the model with them, which typically involves interviewing them again to clarify certain elements of the process. This discovery method offers a detailed picture of the process and its participants. Inconsistencies can be revealed after interviewing multiple participants. Here you can see the typical phases of the interview method. First is the initial interview, then modeling, then validation, and you can repeat the cycle as needed. A second iteration of this cycle is usually enough to get the approval from the interviewee. Now moving on to workshop-based discovery, this grants the opportunity to get a detailed understanding of the business process while having the advantage of resolving inconsistencies between domain experts faster than interviews. This involves multiple participants at the same time. This method may also include two more roles in place of or in addition to a business analyst. A facilitator may be involved to coordinate the spoken contributions of the participants, and a process modeler may be involved to create the process model during the workshop. A detailed process model can hardly be completed within one workshop session. Typically 3 to 5 sessions, each of which being no more than 3 hours long, are required to complete a model. Diligent scheduling and preparation is required due to the involvement of multiple domain experts at the same time. At least one representative should be chosen for each role participating in the process. Also, technical staff that manage the system supporting the process should be involved. As a note, there should not be more than 10 to 12 domain experts in each session because of time constraints. If the process can be undertaken in different variants, each variant should be discovered in separate sessions in order to avoid confusion. In the beginning of the first session, the analyst should set expectations and state the format of the workshop. They should also clarify objectives, the importance, and the scope of the project. A rough model can be made by participants using sticky notes. This rough model can be used by the process analyst to construct an initial BPMN model either during or after the first session. In the beginning of the second session, the process analyst can give a brief introduction to the core BPMN elements so that they can show the model that has been created as a result of the rough sketch during the first session. This model can be used to center the discussion with the goal of validating the current understanding of the business process. Workshops must involve organized facilitation of the participants and also it must foster an atmosphere of openness. Now on to strengths and weaknesses. The strengths and weaknesses of the different discovery methods can be defined in terms of objectivity, richness, time consumption, and immediacy of feedback. For objectivity, evidence-based discovery methods usually provide the highest level of objectivity. Interview-based and workshop-based discovery both must rely on the interpretations of the domain experts involved. However, those involved may have incorrect perceptions of how the process operates or might even hide information from the analyst. Moving on to richness. Interview and workshop-based discovery methods can provide rich insights into how the process operates because the domain experts involved provide clarity on why a process operates the way it does. Talking to domain experts also provides a view into the history of a process and the organization. Evidence-based methods often provide no answer for questions or issues about a process, and they hardly allow for insights to be gained on the personal agendas of various stakeholders. Now, time consumption. Each discovery method requires a different amount of time to complete. However, conducting interviews and workshops are much more time-consuming. Since documentation can usually be made accessible on short notice, it is a good idea to start with document analysis. And now for immediacy of feedback, the methods that have a process analyst engage in direct conversation with domain experts are the best for getting immediate feedback. Because of this, workshop-based discovery is the best for this. For the immediacy of feedback, since domain experts are all involved, which allows inconsistent perceptions to be resolved directly. Sometimes certain discovery methods may not be possible due to certain circumstances. Direct observation may not be possible if part of the process runs in a remote or dangerous or inaccessible environments, such as an offshore oil rig, as an example. Documentation may not exist, and more. Here you can see the strengths and weaknesses of the process discovery methods in this handy chart for table 5.1. And here's table 5.2. You can see the strengths and weaknesses per discovery method. Feel free to pause as needed. Now moving on to process modeling method. It is best to follow a predefined procedure when modeling a business process during process discovery. One way this can be done is to work in 5 steps. First, identify the process boundaries. Second, identify activities and events. Third, identify resources and their handoffs. 4, identify the control flow. And lastly, 5th, identify additional elements. Step 1 is to identify the process boundaries. Identifying the process boundaries is essential for understanding the scope of the process. These boundaries vary depending on the perspective of the party we take. One way to identify the process boundaries is to first identify the business objectives that are required as input and provided as the output of the process. Another way, as far as the end events are concerned, is to identify the possible outcomes of the process. Step 2 is to identify activities and events. Identify the main process activities, and the intermediate events. This step requires that the steps in an event that occurs during a process be modeled with intermediate events in BPMN. Initial activities and events may be revised as needed. If a process is too complex, it is best to focus on the main activities and intermediate events during this stage, adding the others at a later stage. For figure 5.5, you can see 12 activities that have been laid out of an order-to-cash process. Step 3, identify resources and their handoffs. Determining what resources are responsible for each activity is the goal of this step. These resources will provide the basis for the definition of pools and lanes, and also the assignment of activities and events of to these elements. Identify the points in a process where work is handed over from one resource to another. Participants in a process being assigned to a new task typically has to make assumptions about what has been done before. These assumptions must be explicit. Handoff points also help identify parts of the process that can be analyzed in isolation from the rest. They can also be further refined into sub-processes. If external parties are involved in the process, separate pools are used to model them, and message flows are used to depict the handoff between them and the external parties. In this figure, you can see how external parties are depicted in the process model. Customer and supplier are both external parties that are separated into separate pools from the internal parties. Notice how a customer starts a process with a purchase order, and you can also see how the process ends with the customer receiving the product. You can also see the raw material request going to the supplier, which of course would end up with the raw materials being sent back to the warehouse staff. The next step is to identify the control flow. Control flow relates to the questions of when and why activities and events are executed. You must identify decision points, order dependencies, concurrent execution of activities and events, and potential rework and repetition. Decision points require the addition of XOR splits and relevant conditions on the sequence flows originating from these splits. Rework and repetition can be modeled with loop structures. And gateways are used to link concurrent activities that can be executed independently from each other, and events-based splits are used to react to decisions taken outside the process. In this figure, you can notice the control flow arcs in the seller pool. The handoffs are also now more refined in more elaborate dependencies. Step 5, identify additional elements. Extend the model by capturing the involved business objects and exception handlers based on the purpose of the model. For objects, this means adding data stores, data objects, and their relations to events and activities via data associations. For exception handlers, this involves using boundary events, compensation handlers, and exception flows. And next, we have process model quality assurance. Assuring that the model produced is of high quality is crucial. The quality of a process model is determined based on 3 quality aspects. First, syntactic quality, which uses verification to ensure quality. Semantic quality uses validation, and pragmatic quality uses certification. Modeling guidelines and conventions can also be used in order to achieve high quality from the get-go. Syntactic quality relates to the conformance of a process model to the syntactic rules of the modeling language used. There are 2 types of syntactic rules. Structural rules are about the way the various model elements are connected with each other, and behavioral rules relate to the way a process model can be instantiated. Here are some structural rules that apply to a model using BPMN. You can pause and read it at your own pace. Keep in mind a model is structurally correct if it adheres to all of these structural rules. Now moving on to behavioral anomalies. Behavioral rules must be followed in order to avoid behavioral anomalies such as live locks and deadlocks during the execution of a process model. A deadlock occurs when a running process instance is unable to progress further once a given state is reached, meaning that a token gets stuck in one state. A live lock occurs when a process instance is stuck in a loop. A lag of synchronization occurs when 2 or more tokens are in the same sequence flow because they are not synchronized at a certain join gateway. A dead activity is any activity that can never be executed in any instance of a process model. And a block structure is a single entry, single exit process model fragment. Syntactic quality and verification. Continue. In order to consider if a process model is behaviorally correct, or sound, it must satisfy the following behavioral rules. Operation to complete. Any running process instance must eventually complete. Proper completion. At the moment of completion, each token of the process instance must be in a different end event. And no dead activities, meaning any activity can be executed in at least one process instance. Verification is the activity of checking that a process model is syntactically correct, meaning that it is both structurally and behaviorally correct. For figure 5.10, here's an example of a structurally incorrect process model. You can see that the reject order activity has no way of being completed or of simply happening. You can also see that the emit voice activity has an incomplete sequence flow. Semantic quality relates to the adherence of a process model to its real-world process. Validation is the activity of checking the semantic quality of a model by comparing it with its real-world business process. There are two essential elements of semantic quality: validity and completeness. Validity means that all statements that one can make from the model are correct and pertain to real-world processes. Validation can be supported by methods such as workshops and interviews, and process models also often require approval from the process owner, which can be a step in validation. Completeness means that the model has all relevant statements about the business process it is depicting. Pragmatic quality relates to the usability of a process model. There's a focus placed on how people interact with the process model. A way to check for pragmatic quality is to test how well a user understands the model. Certification is the act of checking the pragmatic quality of a process model by investigating its use. The various aspects of usability are understandability, which means how easy it is to read and understand a process model; maintainability, how easy it is to apply changes to a model; and learning, how good a process model depicts how the business process operates in reality. Certification can be achieved by conducting interviews or experiments with users of the model. Rules that strive to provide usability by design exist for process models. Block structuredness, a sound and structured process model that has been shown to be easier to comprehend than its unstructured counterpart. Two essential checks for understandability and learning: consistency between visual and logical structure, meaningful labels that follow specific naming conventions. Here you can see an unstructured process on top and its structured counterpart on the bottom. Here are some modeling guidelines and conventions, are important tools to utilize to improve the pragmatic quality of process models. There are certain objectives for using modeling guidelines and conventions. First, safeguarding model consistency and improving standardization and reuse. Second, reducing the dependency on process analysts. And third, facilitating access to models by non-modeling experts. Also, there's a difference between guidelines and conventions. Guidelines are suggestions, not mandatory, while conventions are mandatory rules. Modeling guidelines and conventions restrict some aspects of a process model. First, vocabulary, where you avoid certain elements. Second, structure, where you limit the structure of a model, such as defining a threshold on the size or the number of hierarchical layers. Third, semantics, avoiding particular elements, element meanings. And fourth, appearance, restricting the model appearance in terms of labels, layout, and notation. Here are the 7 process modeling guidelines. Use as few model elements as possible. Minimize the routing paths per element. Use one start event for each trigger and one end event for each outcome. Model as structured as possible. Avoid OR gateways where possible. Use verb object activity labels. And lastly, decompose a model with more than 30 elements, because the probability of error climbs sharply when models have more than 30 elements. And that is my presentation. I'm sorry for reading a bit quickly. There is a ton of material to cover in my chapter, so thank you for listening.